So today we're going to talk about the ancient Greeks, or the Hellenes as they were often known. And I'm going to begin with a little bit about the Greeks' belief in the creation of the world. So, in the beginning, there was only chaos. Then out of the void appeared Erebus, the unknowable place where death dwells, and the night. All else was empty, silent, endless darkness. Then somehow love was born, bringing a start of order. From love came light and day. And once there was light and day, Gaia, the earth, appeared. Then Erebus slept with the night, who gave birth to ether, the heavenly light, and to day, the earthly light. Then night alone produced doom and fate and death and sleep and dreams and nemesis and others that come to the people out of darkness. Meanwhile, Gaia alone gave birth to Uranus, the heavens. Uranus became Gaia's mate, covering her on all sides. Together they produced the three Cyclopes, the three Hecatocheires, and the 12 Titans. However, Uranus was bad as a father and as a husband. He hated the Hecatocheires. He imprisoned them by pushing them into hidden places of the earth and Gaia's womb. This angered Gaia, and she plotted against Uranus. She made a flint sickle and tried to get her children to attack Uranus. All were too afraid, except for the youngest, Titan and Kronos. Gaius and Kronos set up an ambush of Uranus as he lay with Gaia at night. Kronos grabbed his father and hurt him with the stone sickle, throwing the severed parts of his body into the ocean. The fate of Uranus is not clear. He either died, withdrew from the earth, or he exiled himself to Italy. As he departed, he promised that Kronos and the Titans would someday be punished. From his spilt blood came the giants, the ash tree nymphs, the Erinyes, and from the sea foam where body parts were thrown came Aphrodite. Kronos became the next ruler. He imprisoned the Cyclopes and the Hecatocheires in Tartarus. He married his sister Rhea. Under the rule that the Titans had many offspring. He ruled for many, many ages. However, Gaia and Uranus both had prophesied that he would be overthrown by a son. To avoid this, Kronos swallowed each of his children as they were born. Rhea was angry at the treatment of the children and plotted against Kronos. When it came time to give birth to her sixth child, Rhea hid herself. Then she left the child to be raised by the tree nymphs. To conceal her act, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothing and passed it off as the baby to Kronos, who immediately swallowed it. The child was Zeus. He grew into the handsome youth on Crete. He consulted Metis on how to defeat his father, Kronos. She prepared a drink for Kronos designed to make him vomit up all of the other children. Rhea convinced Kronos to accept his son, and Zeus was allowed to return to Mount Olympus as Kronos' cupbearer. This gave Zeus the opportunity to slip Kronos this very specially prepared drink. This worked as planned, and the other 5 children were vomited up. Being gods, they were all unharmed. They were thankful to Zeus, and they made him their leader. Kronos was yet to be defeated. He and the Titans, except for Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Oceanus, fought to retain their power. Atlas became their leader in battle, and it looked for some time as though they would win and put the gods down forever. However, Zeus was cunning. He went down to Tartarus and freed the Cyclopes and the Hecatocheires, and Prometheus joined Zeus as well. He returned to battle with his new allies. The Cyclopes provided Zeus with lightning bolts and weapons. The Hecatocheires he set in ambush, armed with boulders. With the time right, Zeus retreated, drawing the Titans into the Hecatocheires' ambush. The Hecatocheires rained down hundreds of boulders. With such a fury, the Titans thought the mountains were falling upon them. They broke and they ran, giving Zeus a victory. Zeus exiled the Titans, who had fought against him, into Tartarus. except for Atlas, who was singled out for the special punishment of holding the world on his shoulders. However, even after the victory, Zeus was never safe. Gaia, angry that her children had been imprisoned, gave birth to a last offspring, Typhophius. Typhophius was so fearsome that most of the gods fled. However, Zeus faced the monster, and flinging his lightning bolts, he was able to kill it. Typhophius was buried under Mount Etna in Sicily. Much later, a final challenge to Zeus was made by the giants. They went so far as to attempt to invade Mount Olympus, piling mountain upon mountain in an effort to reach the top. But the gods had grown strong, and with the help of Hercules, the giants were subdued or killed. And so that is where we see much of the art that we're going to see in ancient Greece. So much of it is based on these creation stories, and we look at the different sculptures, and then it all starts to kind of make more sense to us. So the first thing we're going to look at is the very oldest sculptures, and you'll notice that they almost appear like the latest sculptures that we saw of the Cyclades, but more detailed. So this is what was called the kouros. So the Greek word kouros, or plural kouroi, means male youth. And at least from the 5th century before Christ, especially an unbearded male youth. Modern art historians use the term to refer to ancient Greek male nudes, standing with fists to its side and the left foot forward. Ancient Greeks would probably not have separated these figures from other types of archaic sculptures of young men. But in the way we look at them, they weren't like an individual person. They were like a representation of like body, mind, and spirit. So the Greeks felt that it was extremely important to be strong in body, mind, and spirit. And so, and of course, where do we get the Olympics from? The Greek games, right? And so this, and what's the wars that were fought by the gods, were always about strength. So there's this push in Greek sculpture and even in Greek architecture later on for this idea of strength. And we also see how even the gods had a duality. They were good and they were also bad. They did good things, but they did bad things. And so there's this real interesting, theory that it was based on humanism, or how humans acted. So the gods were of course much more powerful than humans, but they had many, many, many human characteristics. And again, there were many gods. It was a polytheistic religion. Until the 1890s, when the term kouros first was applied to this type of sculpture, scholars generally referred to these figures as Apollos, as it was believed that all kouroi depicted Apollo. And as we can see here, that definitely is not the case. And as we move forward, you can see how the kouros start to change. And so if we look at the Klebos and Byton kouros down here at 590 before Christ, we start to see a more soft look to their faces, to their stomachs, their legs, everything. If we look at the first Metropolitan kouros from 600 before Christ, we can see a kind of an angularity, a stiffness. Another thing to note about these sculptures is notice that they can stand. So they're made in a way that they're so balanced they can stand without any extra support. If we look at the Croesus kouros, now just 60 years later, we're seeing more and more naturalism. And so this is that Greek effort to kind of move into humanism. What does it mean to be human? And we can see it in their art. We see it in their mythology, the duality of the gods' natures. We see it in their plays. We see it in, their philosophers, the ideas of reason. So all of those things are very important. Art does not exist without a context. So I want to repeat that. Art does not exist without a context. So there's a culture, a context in which something was made. And those are what we need to figure out in order to understand what we're looking at. If we just look at it, we could say, oh yeah, that's a guy who doesn't have any clothes on, right? And that guy in the 600 before Christ looks like it wasn't made very well compared to the one over on the other side. Well, is that really true? Or was it because the culture was changing and they had more time to make the art? When there's not war going on, when they're not starving, when they're not having to build a house, people make these images that are, think of it like a form of study. You know, the image is making something special. It's making it for posterity. We have these images 2,000 years plus later, and we only have them because someone made them, you know, or we wouldn't have them, and we would know nothing about these ancient cultures if they hadn't left us something behind. So here's the Croesus Kouros and the Gedi Kouros, just to kind of give you an idea of how tall they are, and just the you know, kind of the like the beauty of them. And these were found in Anavios in Attica, and they reside in the Athens National Museum. They're 6 feet 3 inches tall. So the next kind of stage or development we see about 100 plus years later is the Critias boy. And I've kind of made a big jump here, but again, you know, we want to look at the differences. So we can see that parts of him were missing. So rather than to try to recreate his foot and his arms and everything else, nowadays archaeologists don't do that because they know that they could change the meaning. So they only take what's there and available. Now, a long time ago, archaeologists would have thought nothing of creating a whole new leg and putting it on there, you know, and trying to match the other one and creating a foot and so on. The other thing about these is that they're pure white, and we talked about that once before. These most likely were highly painted to look human. So this marble statue is called the Critias boy or the Critian boy. It belongs to what we know as the classical period of Greece. So the sculptures we looked at a minute ago are considered archaic Greece. So there's like different periods: archaic, classical, and then we're going to get to the Hellenic period at the end. So there's high classical, early classical. So this would be early classical. It's the first statue that classical antiquity is known to use a type of a stance called contrapposto. So what we can see here is that one leg is very stiff and the other is relaxed. It's like as if you were in the military and I said to you, stand at attention, and both your legs would be very stiff. And now I say, at ease, and you kind of let your hips move to one side and one leg is like the knee might be bent. So now you've, you know, re-proportioned your weight in a very comfortable way. That's called contrapposto. So more weight on one leg and one side of the body than the other. It creates a natural angle of the hips. Contrapposto was historically an important sculptural development, for its appearance marks the first time in Western art that the human body is used to express a more relaxed psychological disposition. So this is extremely important because up until that time, everything was very stiff. You know, kind of to be looked at, like not to be relaxed, to be human. Just like when we first see the Brassempouy, Lady of Brassempouy, we see a face, the beauty versus no face, right? So this gives the figure a more dynamic or alternately more relaxed appearance. In the frontal plane, this also results in opposite levels of shoulders and hips. For example, the right hip is higher than the left. Correspondingly, the right shoulder will be lower than the left, and vice versa. It can further encompass the tension as a figure changes from resting on a given leg to walking or running upon it, so-called ponderation. This leg that carries the weight of the body is known as the engaged leg. The relaxed leg is known as the free leg. Usually the engaged leg is straight or very slightly bent, and the free leg is slightly bent as well. So the Critias boy torso was found in 1865 while excavating the foundation of the old museum of on the Athenian Acropolis. The Acropolis is an area where there were temples that were all built to the gods. The head of the statue was found 23 years later between the museum and the Acropolis south wall in the latest stage of rubble of destruction undergone in the Persian War. So once the Persians came and attacked Greece, a lot of this stuff was lost. It was destroyed. The fact in conjunction with the analysis of its style is essential to the dating of the statue. There is a marked difference between the Critias boy and obviously the rigid style of the Archaic period. So just to remind you to look at the two, and side by side you can really see the difference. The Kouros, known as the Archaic, is comprised of both elements of realism and almost abstraction. The first element of realism that is blatantly obvious is the body structure and design. It looks like a typical human body. The Critias boy, on the other hand, is far more relaxed, far more natural. The stance is relaxed. There is more fat on the body. The face is softer. The overall Critias boy moves us from Archaic period to the Greek period. So that's kind of the demarcation point. We don't know. There could have been more sculptures like this earlier. So, these figures that have been radiocarbon dated are, the best that we can do. But that doesn't mean that those are absolute. The truth is always changing. That's why we have science, because the science is able to continue to look and find out more information. And the more information we find out, the more that, we can put more definitive descriptions. So the next sculpture I want to look at is this. This is Hermes of Praxiteles. It is the only original work of Praxiteles found at Olympia, intact in its base and several meters under the ground. So it's about 7 feet tall, and it represents Hermes, the messenger of the gods. From the early classical period, there has been a change in Greek art. Such change can be demonstrated by the Hermes and Dionysus pieces of art. The art from the early classical period improves on the element of realism and then begins to remove elements of abstraction. So what we see here is that as we move into the Hermes, as compared to the Critias boy, that we even have a more natural body position, more fat, more actual muscle. The knees are not so squared off. There's a whole different sort of, not necessarily contrapostural, but like a leaning that's going on. The arm is up. The head is turned and looking at, the work. The story is as follows. Thamyale, the mother of Dionysos, died from terror when Zeus appeared in front of her with all of his thunderbolts and all of his splendor. She was thought to be pregnant at the time, and Zeus took the infant and sent him to the nymphs in Crete with Hermes. When the baby started to cry, Hermes, in order to keep him quiet, showed him a shiny object. And so that's what we think that this sculpture would have been holding up, is some type of shiny object as he was looking at the baby. So that's what that sculpture is. So one thing I want to talk about in terms of sculpture is that, there used to be a term before we had cell phones that took pictures and all of these things. It costs money to take a photograph. And that photograph would have been, you had to buy the film, and then you had to wait for the right moment, and then you had to get the film developed. And so when you'd get the perfect picture, you'd say, oh, it was a real Kodak moment, because Kodak was a type of film. And so when we think about these sculptures, one thing to remember is that the pose of the sculpture is not happenstance. It's not by accident. It's very specific to tell a story. And that's what's going on here. We're telling the story from the mythology. The next image is Poseidon. This is a bronze. It's absolutely incredible. Look at the, just beautiful. Beginning with clay or plaster, a full-size model with all the details of the work has to be created first. And then from that clay model, so this whole thing was sculpted in clay first. And then once it was completely sculpted in clay, then the mold would be created. The model, as it was made of a weaker material than either marble or bronze, was often covered by a wooden frame with head, body, and arms and legs with a few layers of extra clay on the outside. The mold is created by covering clay with the clay original with a half-inch thick layer of wax. So the whole thing would get wax melted over the whole bit so that it would have about a half-inch to an inch thickness of wax. And then a much thicker layer of clay on top of the wax. Before the mold consists of the outer covering of the clay was dried, several large nails were inserted through the clay and into the wax to tightly fit the mold and clay model together. The reason for the nails is that they act as a brace, so the model can stay in place. So it does not move once the wax is melted away, existing through a small hole or two drilled in the model, but later filled back up with clay, as it is done when the entire mold and model are heated for the next step. At this point, the wax, with the wax gone, so once you melt the wax, there's this little air pocket between the outside clay and the actual clay sculpture that you created. And the clay model is hardened because you fired it. So it's like a cup, it's hard. With the supporting function of the nails, there would exist a 1/2 inch thick airspace between the mold and the model. This space is then filled with molten bronze, poured down into a small hole or two in the mold. When the bronze has solidified and cooled, the clay mold is removed. So the outside clay is removed and it reveals a hollow bronze statue. Well, it's not really hollow since the clay model has yet to be removed, but that is easily performed by scraping out the model with the small openings in the bottom. So like the feet normally have openings in them. The entire process provided the easiest method to produce hollow bronze sculptures. But whether it or another similar, though more complicated method was used by the Greeks, we can't completely determine. But what I'm trying to tell you here is this was not, a simple process. And to get it to be balanced so that it would be able to stand. Now look at the way the feet are situated on the ground. They are not flat. Right? So the arms are acting as balancing, and it's really, quite a feat to be able to create a sculpture like this. So it's really, I think, really special when we think about the time frame and the ability that they had. So that's the sort of lowdown of how these bronzes are created. Now, we don't see bronzes after this very much. Like the Romans, they didn't, they would just make them out of marble or other materials. They did not do very many bronzes. When citing Greeks' contribution to the world and to culture, there are many areas that we would have to hit. Now, this is a painting by Sandro Botticelli. It's in Rome, and so the contributions include democracy, theater, athletics, philosophy, and many, many more. Music. So, unsurprisingly, its name is Greek. Philosophy it comes from philosophia, which literally means the love of wisdom. And so the Greeks, this is so important to understand that this is the naturalism. This is where it's coming from. How do I make it look more real? How do I, understand what it means to be human? How do I make beautiful music? How do I teach good lessons so that my children will grow up to be good, strong, body, mind, and spirit human beings? Unlike other practices and bodies of knowledge, such as architecture and the visual arts, which were perfected but not invented by Greece is believed to be the birthplace of the philosophy that we consider Western philosophy. In that, the notion of philosophy as the study of basic axioms that comprise knowledge was actually created there. There are, of course, other older philosophical systems in the world, such as Hindu, Samkhya tradition, but they are generally believed to have developed independently. And there is no substantial historical evidence of contacts and exchanges between these cultures until Alexander the Great that would suggest an influence of one over the other. So the similarities between, say, for example, Hindu and Greece are really considered incidental. The thinkers of the time included sophists, or those who follow the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Although each philosopher had their own belief about the way that, what kept the universe and the people moving, and all the theories revolved around the notion of reason. Aristotle combined the thoughts of many of the earlier philosophers in creating what he called the golden mean. This was the point at which ideas and matter are interwoven and balance out the world to create truth. His philosophy weighed heavily on the human mind and its control over bodies and action. All right. So let's move on and take a little bit of a look at Greek architecture. And the first thing we want to look at is, again, kind of falling into those areas that we talked about earlier. The Archaic period, the Classical periods, and then the Hellenic period. So the first period is called Doric. So of the 3 columns found in Greece, the Doric columns are the most simple, just like the Archaic sculptures. They have a capital, which is the top or the crown. So if you look at the example there, and it's basically a circle that's topped by a square. The shaft, which is the tall part of the column, and then its sides. So in this case, we don't have anything else. We just have the capital and the sides, and they're kind of carved out. So if we look at this next one, here's an actual Doric column. There is no base to the column. It just goes straight to whatever it's standing on. The Doric order is very plain, but it's thick and powerful. So Doric, like most Greek styles, works well horizontally on buildings. That's why it was so good with the long rectangular buildings made by the Greeks. So it's very thick. It sort of tapers to the top, but it's not elegant. You know, it's more rough. So there's another look at a Doric column. So another area of Greek architecture, we call them the metopes and the triglyphs. So this is the area that's above the column. So there's the architrave, which is directly above the column. That's that plain area. And then above that, there's the frieze. So the frieze, F-R-I-E-Z-E, had simple patterns. Above the columns, again, the patterns were metopes and triglyphs. So triglyphs meaning 3, and so there would be like 3 flutes or like lines that go kind of in the, you know, to divide the picture. And then the next piece would be a relief, a bas-relief. The metope is a plain, smooth stone section between the triglyphs. Sometimes the metopes had statues of heroes or gods on them. The triglyphs are patterns of 3 vertical lines between the metopes. So the Greeks would tell the story. So if they were going to go to the temple, they would be able to say, well, you know, there's Hercules, and there's the Cyclops, and there's, you know, Zeus. And they would tell the story of some war or some other, you know, thing. So there's like a visual storybook. So the whole temple would be like a book, but physical, like 3-dimensional, telling the story of the culture. And then the stairs, that's called the stereobate, stereobate. So if there's two for stereo, and then the platform on top of the stereobate is the stylobate. So sometimes some of the sculpture, like the temples, would not have steps coming up. It would just have the stylobate. Sometimes it has a stereobate. Sometimes it has multiple, you know, steps, not just 2. And then at the top is the pediment, which is that triangle kind of thing, like many houses have, so the rain could smooth and come off. So here's an actual image of that. And here in this piece, we can see even sculptures that are inside the pediment. And there's some of the bas-relief, the sculptures that are inside the metopes. And there's the 3 column-like pieces that we call the triglyphs. Here's another look at that. And there we have the Doric column, and then the architrave, which is the plain area, and then the area above, which would be the metope and triglyph. So you want to kind of think of it almost like a comic book, where you would have like panel after panel after panel. And so it's a linear story, right? And so as you'd walk around the building, you would get the whole story. The next one is called Ionic. So different than the Doric, they're much taller. This one I have cut off, but when we see the actual examples, you'll see what I mean. And the capital is very different. It's not just round. It actually has like 2, almost looks like ram's horns, and we call those volutes. And then the shaft is actually fluted, meaning that it digs in. And it's much narrower, much taller. There's our architrave, little difference, got some patterning in it. Our frieze, and then the cornice above the frieze, and then we see part of the pediment. So here again, to just, there's our volute, our fluting, and our shaft. And the capital has got volutes. So the shafts had special characteristics. Those characteristics are called entasis, which is a little bulge in the column. It makes the columns look straight, but they're really not, even at a distance, because since you only see the bulging when you're really at eye level. The shafts would appear to get narrower as they rise, so this bulge makes up for that, so it looks straight to your eye, but it really isn't. So the Greeks did a lot of that. Like when you look at the Acropolis, some of the temples on the Acropolis, the Parthenon in particular, actually has kind of an angle to it. It kind of curves in, because that when you look at this long building from the side, it actually looks straight. So the frieze is plain here. The bases are large and look like a set of stacked rings underneath. So this one actually has a base. They don't go flat right to the stylobate. There we can see we have more than one stair. Ionic capitals consist of scrolls above the shaft. The Ionic style is more decorative than the Doric. It's more refined and much more elegant. The next is the Corinthian order. This is the most decorative of all of the columns. The Corinthian also uses an entasis to make the shafts look straight. The Corinthian capitals have flowers and leaves below a small scroll. The shafts have flutes, and the base is like the Ionian, where it's got circles kind of holding it up. Unlike the Doric, the Ionian cornices have a slant, so the cornice roofs are often the Corinthian roofs are often flat. So see the little squares where it says cornice there. Do you see those right there? So those are often they'll call it Greek dental, because it looks like teeth almost. So just to kind of give you a size relationship, these are quite large. And it's usually acanthus leaves that they use for the flowers. And there you can see the tiny little volutes. They're just small, but it's mostly like, plain. And then when we get to other areas in the ancient, we go to like Petra, for example. They have like kind of looking like Corinthian, but they have elephants on the columns, So there's like different things in different cultures, but it'll like help you right away. As soon as you see it, oh, that's a Doric column from ancient Greece. That is a Corinthian column from ancient Greece. That is an Ionic column. And if we look at houses, you can go drive around on the south side or drive around in some of the old bungalows in downtown Milwaukee, and you will find Corinthian or Ionic or Doric columns in the houses. So here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still using the same ideas. So I talked about it a second ago. That was the pediment. Beneath the pediment lies a horizontal beam called the entablature. The entablature basically holds, it's like kind of the roof area. The band contains obviously the architrave, like we talked about earlier, and then the frieze, and then the cornice. So the cornice is like an aha. It's like kind of, pulls it all together. The architrave lies directly on the capitals and is usually plain or not decorated. The architrave can be found today as molding around doors and windows. So that's kind of where that comes from. And then here in the pediment, we can see, again, the sculptures. So now we talk about, we can go back and look at like Hermes and the Poseidon and the Critias boy. And this time, we look at these sculptures and they're literally lying down and doing all different things. And that's because they're sort of set up to fit into that pediment. So the Greeks got more and more, better carvers and more artistic and more human, like, as we get into high classical Greece. So this would be called high classical Greece, right? So they're not just these solid, archaic sculptures that we saw earlier. So here's from the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus. And remember, these would all be highly painted. This would be like looking up at a, rainbow colored comic book, kind of thing, like as if you were in Disney World. This would not be white. Like we still see remnants of paint on these. And the paint that they used most of the time was encaustic, Encaustic, and that type of paint was a pigment that was mixed with a wax, and then they would melt it and it would soak into the marble, and it would give it like a sheen, almost like makeup, and it would just kind of cover the whole area. So this east pediment from the Temple of Zeus survived really well. It depicts a chariot race between King Oenomaus and Pelops, who was the suitor of his daughter Hippodamia. Zeus stands in the center. Here's another. The western pediment depicts the mythological battle between the Lapiths and the centaurs. And there you can see the horses, the human, half horses, centaurs. In this illustration, the centaurs who are drunk at the wedding are attempting to abduct the Lapith women. Apollo stands at the center. The metapiece depicts the 12 labors of Hercules. So again, always telling the stories. So this is the three fates. This is also from one of the pediments. And the three fates were women who were, I don't know if you could call them goddesses, but they were more like oracles, like they could tell the future, or they told the future. But they were part of everyone's destiny. So the white robe morai, or morae, the English for that would be the three fates, were the personifications of destiny. They controlled the fate of every human being and every immortal from birth till their death. Even the gods feared the morai. Zeus himself was subject to their power. The three morai were Clotho, Latius, and Atropos, or in Roman mythology. So a lot of these Greek gods also are the same gods that are in Roman mythology, but they use the Roman language. So the Roman would be Nona, Clotho, Nona, Latius, Decima, and Morta for Atropos. So some of these Greek names we see in medical terminology. So you think of Morta, mortician, or mortal, right? So death. And Atropos in Greek is the same god. So like you heard of atropos, atrophied tissue, right? So that's where that word comes from. They controlled the metaphorical thread of life for every human being. Latius, or a lotter, a drawer of lots, measured the thread of life with her rod, thereby determining how long people, animals, and deities could exist. Her Roman equivalent was decima, or the 10th, like decimal. Clotho, the spinner, spun the thread of life from her distaff onto her spindle. Her Roman equivalent is nona, or the 9th, so meaning 9 months. This, who was originally a goddess called upon in the 9th month of pregnancy. So, nona. And Atropos, inexorable or inevitable, was the cutter of the thread. She chose the manner of a person's death. When she cut the thread, her scissors, someone on earth died. Her Roman equivalent was morta, or death. Dating back to 1400 BC, the Oracle of Delphi was the most important shrine in all of Greece. Now, I don't have an image of that shrine, but I do have, this is from a painting by Michelangelo where he's got the Oracle of Delphi in one of the churches. And in theory, all Greeks respected its independence. Built around a sacred shrine, Delphi was considered to be the omphalos, or the center, literally like the navel of the world. And people would come from all over just to go to the Delphi. And beyond, other cultures would come, everyone came, and they would bring a question about their future, answered by the Pythia, or the priestess of Apollo. And her answers usually were cryptic and could determine the course of everything from when the farmer should plant his seeds to when the empire should declare war. So they really relied on that kind of stuff. So next I want to take a look at the Acropolis. So the Acropolis Hill, or it is often, the term would be Sacred Rock of Athens, is the most important site of the city. During Pericles' golden age of the ancient Greek civilization was represented in an ideal way on the hill, and some of the architectural masterpieces of the period were erected on its ground. The inscriptions on numerous and precious offerings to the sanctuary of Athena indicate that the cult of the city's patron goddess was established very early on in the Archaic period, from around 650 to about 490 or so BC. So she was the patron, goddess, Athena, Athens, hence the term. Acropolis, Greek akros, top, and polis, city. So top of the city literally was the uptown, right? The upper part of the town. For purposes of defense, early settlers naturally chose elevated ground, frequently a hill with precious sides. So we talked about that earlier with Mycenaeans. And they took, they would go to the top of the hill, and then they would have, more embankments and walls to keep people out. Unlike the Minoans on Knossos, who were like on an island, that they didn't really need those kinds of defenses. So the early citadels became, in many parts of the world, the nuclei of what became later the large city. So a lot of times, like in Paris, it's really interesting because the roads kind of go in a circle. They don't go north, west, east, and south, because every time they wanted to expand the wall of the city, there was always a road on the outside of the wall. And then when they moved the wall, that road was still there. So it would be like a circle. So a lot of times people look at the city planning of Paris and they think it's kind of like an egg. It's got like a center and then all these circles that go around. During the classical period, 450 to 330 before Christ, 3 important temples were erected on ruins of earlier ones: the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Temple of Nike, or you would say Nike, but actually it's pronounced Nike. It's dedicated to Athena Peros, Athena Polias, and Athena Apteros Nike, respectively. The Propylaea, the monument entrance to the sacred area, was also constructed at the same time. So this is the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena the Virgin, the most famous surviving building of ancient Greece, and one of the most famous buildings in the world, and has stood atop the Acropolis of Athens for nearly 2,500 years. It was built to give thanks to Athena for protecting the city and for the salvation of Greece and Athens in the Persian Wars. So if we look at the inside of the building, I think it's really important. So this is something we're going to be looking a lot at in these classes, is architectural drawings. And here we can see that, what do we have on the outside? Well, we have Doric columns, right? So there we can see the top of the column is just got the circle. They go flat to the stereobate or to the stylobate. And then on the outside, we look at the aerial view of the design. We can see that these outside columns don't have a door. They go all the way around. Just like the stairs, they go all the way around, okay? And then there's a pediment to the east and a pediment to the west. It is the most important and characteristic monument of the ancient Greek civilizations, and even today it's considered an international symbol. As we said, it is dedicated to the goddess Athena, who is the patron of Athens. It was built between 447 and 438 before Christ, and its sculptural decoration was completed in 432. The Parthenon was built on the initiative of Pericles, the leading Athenian politician in the 5th century of Athens. It was built under the general supervision of the sculptor Phidias, who also had charge of the sculptural decoration. The architects were Iktinos and Callicrates. That might be on a test. Just remember, Iktinos and Callicrates. Some of the financial accounts for the Parthenon survive and show that the largest single expense was the transportation of stone from Mount Pentelicus from Athens to the Acropolis. Nike, pronounced Neekay, Nike, the Temple of Athena Nike, literally means victory. The Roman equivalent would be Victoria. Was a goddess who personified triumph and victory. She was a companion of Athena the Virgin. She was capable of running and flying at great speeds. Nike was the daughter of Phallus and Styx, like the band, S-T-Y-X, and the sister of Kratos, Bia, and Zealous. The Temple of Athena Nike was constructed in 420 before Christ by the architect Callicrates. It is built in the Ionic order and is an amphipro-style with a row of columns in the front of each of its sides. So notice that there's a column in one side and column in the other, and then there's a solid wall. The relief frieze on the upper section of the walls depicts the conference of gods on the east side and the scenes from battles on the other sides. Nike is the most depicted as having wings and wearing a billowing robe, carrying a wreath and a staff. Nike and her siblings were all companions of Zeus. Here we have Nike. This is a bas-relief sculpture of Nike adjusting her sandal. It's a marble parapet decorated with relief representation of Nike, the Athena of victory, protected at the edge of the bastion on the temple that it was erected on. So that would have been on her temple. But look at the beauty of just the way that the marble is going over her leg, and it looks like the fabric is going. Now this is so much more natural than what we saw in early classical, right? So we see how we're getting more and more and more complex in the way that we're representing the human form. The next is Erechtheion. The Erechtheion is an ancient Greek temple in the north side of the Acropolis of Athens. Notably for design, it is both elegant and really unusual. So what does it remind you of? Well, we've got these different levels. So was it built just because of the unlevelness of the ground? Or was there some, looking at the Palace of Knossos of King Minos, maybe that was it. The temple as seen today was built between 421 and 407. But is believed to be a replacement for an older temple since it is on the site of some of the most ancient and holy relics of the Athenians, including the mark of Poseidon's trident. A wooden statue of Athena was believed to have fallen from heaven, and the tomb of Cercops, the tomb of Erechtheus, a saltwater well, and the original sacred olive tree of Athena. The Erechtheion is an Ionic order. It has a prostasis on the east side, which would be like a porch, right? A monumental propylon on the north, and then the famous porch of the Caryatids. So the Caryatids we're going to look at in just a second. The main temple was divided into two sections dedicated to the worship of two principal gods of Attica, Athena, and Poseidon Erechtheus. A relief frieze bearing a representation possibly of the birth of Erechtheus decorates the exterior of the building. So here we see the Caryatids. So the Caryatids are sculptured female figures that serve as a column. So unlike all the orders that we had before, this is a real divergence. Perhaps the most famous examples are those of the Caryatid porch of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis of Athens. The word is derived from the Latin Caryatids and Greek Caryatids, literally meaning Carai, or like Koros, like the maiden. So it's referring to the priestesses of Artemis and the village of Laconia in southern Greece, with the famous temple of Artemis. So Artemis is a Greek goddess of hunting and wild animals and fertility, and she's the daughter of Zeus and Leto, and the twin sister of Apollo. Okay, so let's take a look at the Hellenes versus the Hellenic versus the Hellenistic period. So first we have to look at what's the native term for Greece. So the native term for Greece, that the way the Greeks would have called themselves, would have been Hellas, Hellas. And it is the official name Helleniki Demokratia, or Hellenic Republic in English. The word Greece was adopted by the Romans and eventually became part of the English language as well. So Greece comes from the word Graeciae, which was first used by Aristotle while he was writing about the location of the land that was called Hellenes by his time. According to Greek history, the Hellenic people from the Hellenistic people were the people who lived in the area during the period between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and the Roman victory over Egypt in 31 BC. So now we've moved from the Archaic period, early classical, high classical, or golden age of Greece. We hear golden age with Callicrates and Iktinos doing all their building on the Acropolis. Now we're in the Hellenic period, or the Hellenistic period. So the Hellenic period of Greece was a period of great militarism. The most honorable duty of an ancient Greek man was to serve his city. Greece was divided into city-states, and it was ruled by the people. This was one of the first instances of democracy in the ancient world. Of course, the people only included men, as women of ancient Greece were not given the right to vote. The shift from Hellenic to Hellenistic in Greek history represents the shift from a culture dominated by ethnic Greeks, however scattered, to a culture dominated by Greek speakers of whatever ethnicity and from the political dominance of that particular city-state. In this period, the traditional Greek culture is changed by strong Eastern, especially Persian, influences. So modern historians see the death of Alexander the Great as dividing the Hellenic period from the Hellenistic period. Alexander and the Macedonians conquered the eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and then invaded India, and his successors held on to the territory for some time and controlled the eastern Mediterranean until the Romans took over Greece in the 2nd century before Christ. So characteristics of a good and honorable man at this time were all tied to one thing, and that was the ideas of humanism, just like we've been talking about throughout this entire lecture. Humanism, which was the philosophy that Greeks lived by, dealt with all people putting their duty to the state before any emotional feelings that they had. Marriages were contracted between the father of the bride and the groom of the father of the groom, and were seen as a way to consolidate power and property, and as a way for a man to provide for himself and his male issue. The men married late, usually in their 30s, after having been maybe in relationships prior to that, but not a marriage. Women, however, were expected to be completely chaste and to not show themselves in public or when guests were being entertained. They had their sole side of they had their own side of the house and their own place to eat. Everything. The women married early, usually in their mid-teens, around the same age when boys were expected to enter into war. Because of the great focus on this society on war and militarism, it was preferable for women to give birth to male babies, and female infanticide was practiced quite commonly. So if you had daughters, they might not make it. Women were seen as the head of household duties and were not portrayed in art as strong or as ideal. Even in the theater of the time, all of the roles were played by men. Much like life, the theater did not focus on costumes or settings. The actors were expected to use their bodies to convey who they were and what they were portraying. Emotions were thought to be irrational and hindering to those trying to accomplish great things for the culture, for the state. Men were constantly trained in the art of war and attended military schools far away from their families from a very young age, at sometimes 7. With the decline of the Greek Empire, more emotions are portrayed in all of the artwork, including poetry, theater, oratory, philosophy, and sculpture. Humanism was also reflected in the artwork of the time. Sculptures were very symmetrical and ordered in the classical Greece, sculpture, but then later on we give way to asymmetry and chaos. Men were displayed in art as they actually were in daily life, which was nude. Men didn't wear clothes in Greece, for the most part. The human body was thought of as a military tool, and it needed to have a perfect physique, and it was to be admired, not gawked at. And so that was part of it. It was like, if you started getting fat or whatever, like you people would pay attention. It's like, what's going on here? So it was all about like this idea of the body being strong, body, mind, and spirit. So let's take a look at some of the sculpture. So this is the Venus de Milo. She depicts Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and physical beauty. It is a marble sculpture. The sculpture dates back to about 130 before Christ and is thought to be the work of Alexandros of Antioch. In 1820, the sculpture was found on the Aegean island of Melos by a peasant named Yorgos. He hid it from the authorities, but was later discovered by a Turkish official who seized the sculpture. A French naval officer, Jules Dumont d'Urville, recognized its significance and arranged for it to be purchased by the French ambassador in Turkey. I believe it's in the Louvre. The next one we're going to look at is Laocoon. Laocoon was the son of Osiris and was a priest of Poseidon or of Apollo by some accounts at Troy. So the Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid detail Laocoon's death. So what happened here is, and this is why I like to show the sculpture to really talk about Hellenistic, right? So we're not just talking about the human form as being a natural human form, but we're looking at emotion. And so what are we seeing and why, what is really going on here? So Laocoon was a priest, and he warned his fellow Trojans against the wooden horse that was being presented to the city by the Greeks. In the Aeneid, Virgil gives Laocoon the famous line, "Equato ne credite tucre, quid ed est timio denos et donos ferentes," or "Do not trust the horse. Trojans, whatever it is, I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts." So there's always been kind of glommed together into the word beware of Greeks bearing gifts, right? So in his anger that the Trojans had ignored his advice, Laocoon threw his spear at the horse. Poseidon, who was supporting the Greeks, subsequently sent sea serpents to strangle Laocoon and both of his sons, Antiphanes and Tymbraeus. Both accounts say Apollo sent the serpents for an unrelated offense, and only unluckily timing caused the Trojans to misinterpret them as punishment for striking the horse. But Laocoon, in this particular sculpture, what's so important about it is that it's a group of three. It lives in the Vatican Museum now. It represents the Trojan priest and his two sons literally being crushed to death by snakes as a penalty for warning the Trojans against the wooden horse of the Greeks. And we just talked about how important it was to have sons in this culture, and those were the only two sons he had. And so according to the story, Poseidon had the snakes crush his sons before his eyes so he would know that his seed would be wiped forever from the face of Gaia, from the face of the earth. So this brought great anguish, and that's why the look on his face, the expression on his face, is one of just complete sorrow and terror. It's usually dated to the 2nd or 1st century before Christ and the 1st century A.D., although whether it is an original Hellenistic piece or a Roman copy has always been a matter of dispute. And there are other copies. So you see this one without the arm on it and without his hand, like Laocoon's hand is missing at the top. There was at one time where those had been made and added, and then they took them off later on because they don't really know exactly what they look like, so then it was decided to take them off. But this too would have been highly painted. The most famous representation of the Nike is the Winged Victory of Samothrace in the Louvre in Paris. And there we have it. It's at the top of a stairs. It's really, I have been there. I just cannot tell you how beautiful this sculpture is. And to see it at the very top of a staircase, it's and the way it's lit and the way the Louvre gave it like this whole entire room space, it's really something. So the Winged Victory, considered the finest extent of Hellenistic Greek sculpture, portrays the goddess of victory alighting on a ship's prow with her wings spread and her clinging garments rippling in the wind. So here we can see from the side. It's 8 feet tall. Her head is obviously missing. It was created by a Rhodian sculpture between 220 and 190 before Christ, and it was discovered in the Aegean island of Samothrace in 1863 and immediately sent to the Louvre Museum in Paris, where it is displayed on the landing of the Daru staircase. The statue's head and arms are missing, but this would have been at the front of a boat, right? And you would have seen this as they were going to war with you and it was coming at you. So again, when we talk about the Hellenistic period, obviously Laocoon has this great emotion, and here on the other hand we have this beautiful winged victory who's like trying to help us win the war. The fabric is like blowing in the wind. We can see parts of her body. She's really beautiful, and that's the way that the story relays who she is. And so there's our last piece. And so next time, we're going to start to talk a little bit about early Rome. All right, then.